kick this off. So, first of all, thank you so much, everybody here, for coming to our event called How to Communicate More Compassionately About the Subject of Suicide. This is an event or a subject that I wanted to do an event for a very long time. And then, fortunately, I met Caroline, who is an expert in this area, and she introduced me to Tom. I'll allow these brilliant guests of mine to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about the work they do in a second. I'm going to introduce myself first. My name is Jamie. I'm the founder of a company called Reachus. Essentially, what Reachus does is provide mental health support towards organizations that we believe is an upgrade from traditional EAP, which in many cases is not really as effective as it could be. The reason that I wanted to do this event and be part of this conversation is because this subject touches all of us. And 2 days ago, there was no better example of that. I was sitting on my computer ready to do a demo for an organization that I assumed was a demo. Normally, companies reach out to me and ask me about my services, and we talk about their situation and try and find a solution for them. Instead of someone from an organization, on my camera appeared a very tattered looking fella in his bed that had found my website somehow. And when we started to talk to each other and he opened up a little bit, it became very, very clear that he wanted to end his life. And I thought, wow, that was 2 days ago. What a perfect example that this is a subject that will, if not already, will touch all of us. And I think we could do a lot better in terms of how we communicate about it. And that's why I think this event is so valuable. So before I continue, I just wanted to say just a couple of house rules. The first is if everyone could keep their microphones on mute. If you would like to share something, please feel free to pop it in the chat and I can refer to it if we've got a moment. Or if you'd like to say something, feel free to just pop up your hand with the little emoji in there. Caroline's going to go through another couple of house rules in terms of language in a second. But first, I guess it would be great, Tom, if you could introduce yourself, fella. Who are you and what is it that you do?
Hello, thanks for having me. My name's Tom. I run Bamboo Mental Health. That's basically me. And I review organizations. I do things like mental health assessments, audits, and I do talks and I do training. And my stuff is built on hundreds of employee interviews and thousands of lines of data. So I advise organizations. I'm not medical or therapeutic. I advise organizations and teams and leadership teams.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tom. And Caroline, could you give us an intro to who you are and what it is that you now do?
Yes, thanks, Tom. And yeah, thanks, Jamie, again for asking us along. So I'm Caroline. I've been working in internal communication for the last 10 years or so, which was all around any sort of communication within a big organisation that involved different channels, different ways to communicate, different messaging with different audiences. A lot of that was involving mental health and wellbeing, but it wasn't somewhere I specialised in until I lost my husband to suicide back in 2018, which was clearly a huge shock. My children were 9 and 2 at the time. And that changed everything about my life, my purpose, and what I wanted to do. So my mission now is to bring together that expertise that I have in internal communication and that passion for keeping this subject of suicide post-prevention, mainly, and I'll go on to that later, out in the open so that people can feel comfortable having these conversations that are not comfortable conversations.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. If anyone else would like to introduce themselves, please feel free to pop it in the chat, who you are, where you're from, and why you're here, why you've attended this event. Caroline, could you just cover a couple of the ground rules when it comes to language, please?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I mean, we've got ground rules written down here. We don't like to use the term rule, but they're kind of safeguarding safety guidelines that we like to talk about. I think you've mentioned a couple already. We are recording this session to make sure that those that aren't able to attend can view it afterwards. One of the things that we want to make sure that we don't do is disclose any personal information, personal stories, sharing too much information around things like location, if you know somebody that's taken their own life, and particularly method. Those are two things we don't talk about. Because we're talking about a really heavy subject, that can be quite triggering for people. There's no judgment here whatsoever. If you feel you need to switch off, walk away, take a few minutes out, please do so. And if there are things you want to talk about after the session, please do get in touch with us and we can talk through anything there. Just to make it clear, we're not therapists. None of us here are here to provide any therapy to anybody. That goes for people in the chat as well. Please don't try to fix other people's problems. If we are talking about them, we're here to have broader conversations than that. We're keeping this a really safe space, so we want people to ask questions, get involved. We're going to put some prompts in the chat, that sort of thing. So please feel free to have any discussions that you want to, put questions in. But like I say, if we can avoid talking about things like method and location. Is there anything that I have missed on that, Tom? Do you think?
Well, there's something we hadn't thought about here. You got lots of really expert trainers by the sound of things in the chat box and in the audience. So look, this is not a training session, as such, is it? We're going to cover off lots of experiences, but we're not going to try and compete or claim this is a type of training. All right. So don't, rest assured, we're not trying to do that thing. I think you should do another one, Jamie, with the trainers in the audience to kind of do that for people.
I love that.
Yeah, I think training is clearly a whole different kettle of fish and a different set of content altogether. We will mention just a couple of numbers. So shout is a text line. I think we can put the link to that in the chat for people if they're struggling or they need to kind of vent or get some support from somewhere. You can text them. Obviously, Samaritans, we all know, is there to support people 24/7 as well, and that's a phone number, so we'll put the number for them in the chat as well. We did mention just covering off a little bit about vocabulary, which I think was something that people feel very uncertain about when it comes to this topic in particular, and very cautious about discussing in case we say the wrong thing or we end up indirectly offending somebody or at least being worried that we're going to do that. There's a couple of phrases that we do recommend trying to avoid. I will never come down hard on anybody that uses these phrases inadvertently because nobody sets out to offend anybody. It's just good to know some of the ones that could be quite triggering and understand that we're trying to use them less and less if possible. And the key one there is the phrase committed suicide, which I imagine many of you here understand the reason behind that. I'll just explain. Back up to the 1960s, suicide was a crime. It had all these connotations around it, that it was seen as something somebody had done wrong, not accepted by society, and almost increased that stigma that existed around it. And when people use the phrase committed suicide, it can be really triggering for those who have lost somebody in that way. So it's something we try to avoid using altogether wherever possible. And it slips into language. It's a very ingrained phrase, but it's something we're trying to kind of move away from. And just a couple of others as well. Things like somebody was successful at suicide or somebody completed suicide, almost kind of using that sort of positive language around it. And conversely, things like somebody failed at a suicide attempt, phrases like that can be really emotive, and almost add to that stigma and that kind of shame around, I failed at this, so we try and avoid using phrases like that. There are alternatives that, nobody likes talking about this subject regardless, but if we're talking about this subject, somebody has taken their own life, died by suicide, we have to use direct language, and those are much more preferable phrases. So yeah, I'll pass back to you, Jamie, to carry on.
No, that's great. I think what we're going to do now is kind of jump into some of Tom's experiences. So Tom, if you'd like to kind of share why this is a relevant subject for you outside of I guess, your job?
Yeah, I'm gonna share one inside my job, one outside my job. Outside my job, I have been acquainted with or known pretty well about 7 people now who've taken their own lives, all of them men. And each time it happens, there's another kind of cut goes in, and there, there there's been suicide and harm in my family, my immediate family, and I'm not alone in saying that. I've thought about things to do with harm as well, and I think a lot of people have. We just find it really hard to say, and that's completely understandable. And in workplaces where where psychologically it's not safe to speak up about general things such as work problems or colleague relationship problems or that kind of thing, or my sense of control over my hours and that kind of stuff. In areas like that, it's even harder to talk about the difficult stuff. You've only ever spoken to your manager or your supervisor about work stuff, and then the experiences and feelings come up that are as powerful as these. Where do you take that? So I do a lot of research and data, and I know that up to half of people, depending on the organization, haven't told anybody at work. Some might have told a colleague, some might have told a manager, but a lot of people haven't told anybody. And I think that's it's the organization's go to get this right. So what fuels my fire is getting organizations to make it a safe space for people to speak up.
Brilliant.
It's great.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And Caroline, would you kind of jump in with some more detail about your experience in the subject, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Just before I do, just on the point of workplaces there that Tom mentioned, I will just highlight the draft British standard that's just been released, all around suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention in the workplace. It's fantastic, comprehensive, really user-friendly information in there, lots of toolkits, lots of data, different things around myths, that sort of thing. I would urge everybody to look it up, and we can put the link in the chat there. They actually share a few statistics that help kind of highlight the need for these conversations even further around things like 1 in 5 adults have thought of taking their own life. 1 in 15 people have made a suicide attempt. And for every death by suicide, around 135 people are impacted, me being one of them, and potentially many more people who are on this call today, unfortunately. So my experience, as I mentioned earlier, life was very normal for me. I worked part-time in my internal comms role. My husband, Steve, was a field marketing manager in telecoms, and we had 2 young children. He was getting ready to start a new role one morning, November 2018, confirmed what time he would pick our daughter up from Cubs that evening and left for work. And that was the last time I ever saw him. And he was missing for 2 days and was found on the Wednesday morning, 2 days later, having taken his own life. I think there's often the assumption that there's a note or a reason or an idea as to why somebody would have done something so drastic. But I was given none of that. So the emotions, the heavy emotions that come with a loss by suicide, and I've heard them described as grief with the volume turned up because the complexities around a loss by suicide are so much greater. But these emotions are unbearable, and we then have to carry on with life. I had a home, I had children, I had my job. I went back to work after being on compassionate leave for a few weeks when I was at my lowest ebb, exhausted mentally and physically, and still in shock and still trying to work out how the hell I was going to move forward with my life and work out what happened. It was over a period of time that I did start to realize that life grows around a loss like this. And I began to connect with all sorts of people who were working within this area, whether that was on suicide prevention, whether they were training, whether it's on postvention, which is the support given to people after a loss by suicide, and how we make sure that we don't continue that spiral, because people who have lost someone to suicide are more likely to then go on and take their own life. So that cycle continues. So there's a lot of work that I've done personally, digging deep to find the strength I kind of knew I needed to find in myself, to look after my children, to continue living a life and finding a sense of hope again, which was the kind of key thing for me. And that's what fuels my fire. And that's why I've been delighted to come across people who are on this call today, people like you, Jamie, like Tom, who are equally passionate in this area. And why I feel it's so important that within the workplace, we need to be able to have these conversations about suicide, about mental health, and all that relates to it, and normalize what is otherwise such a heavily stigmatized thing. So yeah, we've covered a lot there, and I know that people have their own experiences. A lot of people, once we start talking about this, will relate an experience they've had, or somebody they know that has lost somebody close to them, or whether you've lost a colleague at work, and we'll deal with it very differently. And it's these conversations that help us kind of bring that to the fore and talk about how we move forward with them in a positive way.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that, both of you, your experiences. Caroline, you suggested at this point we have 30 seconds just to reflect on some of the emotions that are probably coming up within people in the group. Would you just quickly prompt us into that?
Yeah, absolutely. As I say, when we talk about this subject, it can very quickly kind of knock us off our feet, because it will remind us often of our own personal experiences, our own times when we've lost someone, not even necessarily to suicide. We're talking about the broader subject of death and loss and grief and all this really horrible, heavy stuff that goes with it, that comes along with human beings. And whether we're at home or at work, it doesn't switch off. So it's good to just take a moment to kind of soak up some of that, reflect on that, put how you're feeling in the chat box if you want to, any concerns you might have for each other, but just take 30 seconds or so to just have a quiet reflection moment, I think, at this point.
Okay, I think that was great. Definitely had a lot of emotions that were started to appear when I was listening to you both. I've read Daddy Blackbird. It's a beautifully written book, and I suggest that everyone that has the opportunity, please do read it. And I have had some personal experiences in this area. One of the things that you've both noted in conversations we've had in the past is compassion, which is why we included it in the title. Caroline, would you kind of like to discuss the importance of compassion when we are reflecting on these types of emotions that I'm talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I kind of see it as a bit of a key that unlocks some of these conversations. And one of the ways I kind of explained that and thank you for mentioning the book. When I was writing the book, which actually I never intended to do, it was a tip from my therapist that we often have around things like journaling, to get some of these things out of our head, spinning around and onto paper. And I started writing some of the thoughts and feelings and experiences I'd had. And at one point I looked down and there was about 20,000 words in front of me. And I thought, well, I may as well carry on and write a book now. But because of my comms background and the way that I wanted to make sure that I was writing it for a specific audience, I kind of set that in my head as people like me. So mainly women who had lost somebody to suicide, a partner, been left behind to kind of deal with the aftermath of that, raise children, carry on working, accept this entirely new identity. I'd gone from being a wife to being a widow, and I wanted other people to feel that they weren't entirely alone if they were in that situation. So in my head, everything I wrote was for people like that. And I was getting responses from people saying, I don't feel quite so alone. I definitely feel some comfort. I'm still traumatized and grieving, but I don't feel like I'm on my own when I read words like that. And I understand that other people have the same thoughts and feelings, and that you're venting the anger that you feel, and that you're talking about that whole sense of just abandonment and all the other awful emotions that come with this. But as I was sharing this with these specific group of people, I was getting more and more messages from a completely different group, and it was men who were messaging me privately because they were saying things like, I don't feel safe to speak about this at work, or I don't feel like I can talk to my family about it because I don't want to let them down, or whatever it might be. But because you're opening up this conversation, I feel like I can approach you and talk to you. And much like the example of the chap that you gave earlier, some of these people were in a really dire situation mentally and emotionally, and on the edge, and telling me that. And having read my story and read some of the posts that I was sharing, I'm very open, very raw. I don't sugarcoat any of it. Some of it is really, really shit, and it's honest. And when they were reading this sort of stuff and saying things like, I I was wanting to take my own life. I didn't want to be here anymore. I couldn't cope with the pain anymore. But reading your story and understanding the pain that your children are in, or understanding the journey you're on, I can't do that to my family. But now I don't know what I can do. I need help. And I feel like that's massive, to allow people that space to open up, first of all. And I take my hat off to anybody that feels they can do that. But I think there's now a gap. So when I see that person in my head, that chap who's on the train and he's read a post and he's opened up, and then he walks into work and he's face to face with his miserable line manager, or he's got a team where there's too much work going on, and they're not really considering in any way the impact that it's having on team members. How are we looking after that guy? What are we doing to make sure that he picks up on that sense that he's feeling about himself, and is able to move into a brighter place, rather than continue down that dark tunnel that I know my husband went down, and I had no way of doing anything about it. So that's my mission, and that is where compassion comes into it, because I don't think we need to go into a huge amount of detail around shifting entire policies and programs and everything else. I mean, that's great, and a lot of that needs to happen, but there's smaller things that we can all do in our day-to-day communication, built around kindness and compassion and understanding and human-centered conversations, that will make a difference to people. So the sessions that I run through Daddy Blackbird Communications are called my 7 switches sessions. And there's 7 different things that I think we can all do in terms of just switching up the way we communicate about this topic. We don't have time to cover all of them today, but I thought we could pick up on a few of them, make this a two-way conversation as well. I'd love to hear what people listening in think of some of these as well. And Tom's going to bring in some of his experiences as well around some of them. So we're not trying to fix the issue of suicide on this session. We're very realistic around what we can achieve, But I think if we spread some ripples of compassion and kindness and understanding and human-centered communication, that's a really good place to start.
Yeah. Can I come in, Caroline, for a second?
Love you to
Just
come
briefly, as when organizations get this right, compassion that we think of as an emotional stance is actually often very much about process, and it is intentional. It doesn't happen by accident, and it's explicit. We tell people we are active. It's not just sort of a thing that you might have if you're the nice lady in HR. It's an organizational process that is planned, intentional, and creates an atmosphere and where we are able to speak up early, or where we are able to have conversations that are quite difficult, and to assist when difficult things happen. So it really does stuff. It's real.
Absolutely. And like you say, it's intentional, isn't it? We're
Yeah.
busy. We've all got massive to-do lists, whether that's at home or at work or whatever else. And sometimes we need to be intentional.
Like an underman.
Yeah.
Underman.
Jordan, I think you got your mic on.
Sorry, I've got it.
Nice.
We okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. So on those switches, I've used a lot of the conversations that I've had with the people that I've been talking about, some of these guys who have been really open and honest and sharing their innermost thoughts. And there's so much that I've been able to learn from that honesty to build into these switches that are always continuing, and I'm always kind of building into to the content of them. But we'll cover 3 of them today. And the first one was from a chap who'd contacted me and said, regular little reminders like this can help keep dads like me going. And I remember thinking how much pressure that creates for people, particularly me, when I'm thinking I need to keep talking about this. If it's feeding a positive response in people, and there's men out there who are fathers who are seeing what I'm talking about and understanding that I can't leave my kids, I can't do that, but I've got to do something to make myself exist in a better place than this. So understanding that regular communication is making a difference, it shocks me and it frustrates me when there are organizations out there who are talking about this subject once a year on Suicide Prevention Day, which is in September, and then that's it until the same time rolls around the following year and we decide we've got to tick the box again. It's nowhere near enough to have these tokenistic sessions once a year. If we're trying to make this a normal conversation where people feel safe to speak up, we need to be moving away from this really inconsistent communication or very infrequent communication to much more regular conversations about this. And it's not just down to an organisation to be sticking things in the newsletter every month about mental health and how we look after ourselves. It's down to people like us, all of us, to be sharing the things that we're coming across. I'm on LinkedIn a lot of the time, and I see every single day people making the most amazing videos about suicide awareness, or they're running brilliant podcasts, or having conversations like this today. And if we're sharing these conversations and these videos, articles, whatever it is that you're coming across, there's often support services related to those as well. So they're staying top of mind at the same time. So it's a responsibility for all of us to keep these things top of mind, to keep sharing, whether that's with friends and family, whether that's on a Slack channel at work, whether you're a line manager and you're running meetings or toolbox talks in the morning and you want to point someone in the direction of something really good that you've seen that you think will make a difference, don't be afraid to share it. We need to move away from this infrequent, once a year token gesture to something much more regular. There are organizations out there that have lots of different resources that are really worth looking into. So I would definitely recommend them. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Tom because I think you've got some points to add on this as well.
Yeah, we want to hear people's initiatives that they're doing locally. Yeah, but I just want to say that this is not once and done. It's not one training. It's not one post by somebody senior. It's all of those things. It is a frightening because it's a complex and personal subject for the workplace. So a sort of layered approach is really helpful and give people the time to tune in. And it's better that we have a drip feed than one great wash and wave of stuff. It gives people time to acclimatize to the subject that's quite difficult for them. And it also gives you more opportunity to get through to people alongside all the other communications that are happening. Things like corporate communications or organizational change and that kind of thing. So, we've got to reflect that we are now talking about this stuff a bit more than we did. And it's also got other subjects alongside it, neurodiversity or menopause and reproductive health and those kind of things. They're all valid. So we've got to just take that kind of low and slow approach. We're talking the slow cooker, not the big firework. To mix my analogies up.
Thank you for that, Tom, because I was actually going to play devil's advocate there for a second and just pick your brain on there are plenty of subjects that need talking about and need constant discussion and awareness drawn to them, and how do you navigate making sure that all of the subjects get some time and get some resources?
Yeah. So my answer to that is don't try and do all the subjects. Do the subjects that are relevant to you. How do you know what's relevant? Talk to people and run something. You can run wellbeing assessments or stress risk surveys and pick up on the topics that are relevant to people. So we are. We're talking about suicide today, but we might commonly find things like sleep and switching off or financial cost of living type things, and they're relevant to this kind of subject. And each time you do that, it just gives people another opportunity to disclose, another opportunity for you to put in the support mechanisms to promote your first aid or other trainings that you've got, and just in that way, that's how we become more regular on this topic.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's
great. I would add
stay relevant.
Yeah, I'd add in terms of how you prioritize. One of the organizations I'm working with at the moment is a huge global organization who have 8 different employee resource groups. And the reason I've started working with them is because their veterans group identified that suicide was something that was touching more and more people within this group, and they chose it as the topic that they wanted to discuss more. And that's when they got in touch with me, and I've been doing some talks and some work with them. So absolutely vital to speak to your people, understand what the priorities are. But also, in the meantime, we need to be keeping this topic out there more often than these awareness days. I'm not down on awareness days. I think they're really good for what they are, and they start conversations, but those conversations need to continue. I think that's the key. If we use them as a starting point, absolutely fine, but that's just a starting point. It needs to carry on. I think we did ask in the comments if anybody's had any brilliant resources or any content they've come across, to just share it in the chat so that other people can share that on and see it for themselves as well. It'd be great to understand what you're being inspired by, what you're seeing.
It's inspiring, I think, to hear the story of the organization that you're working with, who has created an environment in which people feel comfortable saying, we'd like to talk about this thing.
Yeah.
Because often people work within an organization where they don't necessarily feel comfortable disclosing that they want to talk about something as heavy as this subject. So that is great to hear. I would say that's pretty inspiring.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I'm so pleased to be working with organisations. Like I spoke to them yesterday, and the feedback so far has been, we're just delighted to know that this conversation is out there now, that we've started it and that we're continuing it, and that we're an organisation that's brave enough to even say the word. So I think that's fantastic, and we just need to hear more and more of that. But yeah, please do share anything that you've come across that we can pass around to one another.
I like Steve's
Yeah,
point about sharing other people's work on this. I've worked in this space for about 10, 12 years now, and I have to relearn all the time that some people are very, very new to this topic, this conversation. They've never spoken about it, hasn't been said. And you're just sending out these lifeboats like Steve's describing, sharing content from others, just sending out the little lifeboats. You never know who's going to climb in one. You don't know when you're going to need one.
Yeah,
yeah.
I love that.
And fortunately, we've got some really, really fantastic people on LinkedIn. If anyone's not on LinkedIn, that are brave enough to share about subjects such as this, including brilliant Sophie Wardell, who's in the audience. So thank you, Sophie, for sharing topics such as this on your page. It really does a lot. I'm just conscious of time a little bit. We will come back to some of the messages in the comments if we have time. But could we jump into switch number 2? Would that be possible, Carolyn?
Yeah, absolutely. So the second of the switches that we'll talk about today came from a guy who got in touch with me and said, one thing that stuck with me is how little knowledge I have about suicide, and how little those around me know. And we talk about this issue of shame and stigma and all this kind of heavy fog that exists around the subject of suicide. And so much of that is because we're not communicating about it, because people don't really understand it. I'm not expecting people to go out of their way to go and do a qualification in it or to kind of study it every day. But I think if organizations and individuals all upskill slightly and learn a little bit more about what sits behind this, we can all be a little bit less frightened when it comes to having these conversations, and a little bit less standoffish. And it kind of boosts that confidence to be able to ask one another those really important questions if we're worried about each other. I think getting more informed about suicide is switch number 2. It's all about just going out and finding a bit of information. We've talked about that regularity side of things, but it's upskilling what you know about suicide and sharing that within our organizations. So there's some really, really great places out there. I do some volunteering for an organization called SOBS, which stands for Survivors of Bereavement by Suicide, who have some great stuff on their website. There's an A to Z on the website of Suicide & Co, which is fantastic. It's not heavy going, but it's really informative. Things on the Samaritans website, on Mind, all of these sorts of organizations. And please do share anything that you're aware of that will help to kind of upskill people, just to understand a little bit more about this topic and be less afraid of what sits behind it. I think that's kind of key to that, but I think Tom can probably add some points that you had around the training element of that as well.
Yeah, I think it can be quite frightening. Organizations think they've got to do it all, but they haven't. And like with mental health training, I think the core things that people really need to know is to know how to make their team a safe space where it's all right to say things, spotting some of those signs. I know they're not always clear. Having a conversation, getting people to the right support. So safe, signs, support, and conversations. They're the things for me. And the big thing that surprises managers when I do a little bit of training on this, I'm not a suicide expert trainer, But do always put that moment into general manager training or mental health about it's okay to seek clarification if you're not sure, if your guts are churning at what somebody's saying, to say, are you thinking about hurting yourself? And that's a really big moment. It's the bit where everybody in the room goes quiet because it's a courageous question, but it's very important to identify what kind of conversation you're having.
I think that that's a really key point, Tom. And there's I mentioned the British Standard earlier. There's 8 different myths that are listed in there. And if that's the only thing you were to read, then you will definitely understand more about this topic. But one of those myths is if we ask someone if they're thinking of suicide, or hurting themselves or whatever language we want to use, we're putting that idea into their heads that wasn't already there. Now, that is absolutely not the case. When we are saying that to somebody, what we're doing is giving them the opportunity to say, yes, I am struggling. They might not necessarily say that at that point in time. They might come back later. It might take a few prompts. It might be something that you need to switch your language around, but you're not going to put the idea in somebody's head. And I think that's one of those big fears. And I think it's a good example of why upskilling a little bit and learning a little bit more about this topic and uncovering some of those myths and facts that exist is a really important point, why it's the second of my switches.
You can understand, though, can't you, why people are terrified of this? I mean, they think it's literally life or death. Like Sophie's saying, the fear of getting it wrong or our own discomfort is part of what prevents people from having the conversation. And we've got to break through that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I totally agree. And I'll be honest, I was incredibly uncomfortable about the idea of having this event because of some of this internal anxiety I have related to the subject. So for me, it's an incredible opportunity just to be able to listen and to learn.
What was that anxiety that was existing within you then, Jamie?
I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. I mean, it's a subject that has been very relevant recently. And so I guess there is, like Sophie says, definitely a fear that maybe I got something wrong, or that I will get something wrong. And I think that's probably the biggest part of it. Kind of the example I gave at the beginning of this conversation of someone 2 days ago that was in front of me and was really struggling, and I didn't really know how to address it. When I spoke to you guys the same day, I actually felt a bit anxious about telling you about how I reacted to the situation because I wasn't sure if I got it right. And I think there's a lot of that.
Yeah, I absolutely understand that. I think what's encouraging is that this chap felt safe to speak to you about it in the first place. That's a great thing to hear. I think it's very hard to say the wrong thing. In my experience, having lost someone to suicide, the worst thing that anyone can ever do is say nothing at all. If you know somebody's struggling and you don't address that, that can be much more damaging than being a little bit clumsy with the language that you're using. And like I said at the start, we all slip up with some of the language that we're using. We need to just be more conscious and try and change some of that language. But ultimately, it comes down to saying something rather than nothing at all. That silence can be the thing that feeds into the dark tunnel that people end up going down and can't turn around and come back from.
So maybe a willingness to lean into this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Which takes bravery and courage, and it's something that we need to keep talking about. And we're here if you're ever thinking, I'm worried about someone, what shall I say? Get in touch and we can chat through that conversation with you. Or we can have more of these sessions and have more of a kind of workshopy run through of things. But it's something that we need to continue talking about to make it more normal, familiar, and much less uncomfortable for people.
Because it is. Just to call it, this, if you're human, you'll feel a lot of stuff around in these moments. And even if the front face is like, okay, I've got this, internally it's like, whoa, my washing machine is going here inside. And that's reasonable, I think.
Absolutely.
It's all right to feel like, I don't know if anybody has like come across, actually Sandy's actually just mentioned if you saw somebody having cardiac arrest. I have come across a couple of accidents in my time performed for some first aid. And afterwards, really wobbly, like really physically very shaky after that. Yeah.
Yeah. absolutely. Should we go on to the third switch?
Please, let's do it. Let's jump in.
So this was a message that I had from somebody wasn't that long ago. Again, another chap, and he'd said to me, hearing you talk about the things others aren't prepared to say helps me daily. Your words move and inspire me. And that moved and inspired me to tears, actually, to hear the fact that just by being open and honest about something awful that happened to me and my family, I'm able to help others and to kind of motivate people to feel safe to say things themselves. So this last of these three switches that I'm covering today is all about moving to being much more authentic. And I know that's a word that we band around a lot of the time, but there's this kind of insincerity that we carry with us when we go through the door into the office. And we talk about bringing our whole selves to work, but what does that actually look like in reality? What does that mean? And as soon as we're out the door, we suddenly become ourselves again. This is all about being much more authentic, whether we are talking peer to peer, whether we're a line manager responsible for a team of people, whether we're a senior leader who is addressing somebody in the latest town hall, whatever that might be. Sharing our own experiences of when things haven't gone quite to plan, or when we've had a period in our lives where we've really struggled, is such a powerful thing. And rather than glossing it up and making it look fancy and sticking it on Instagram and pretending that that's what our lives actually look like, this is all about showing people that we're real, that we've got our ups and downs, and that we struggle at times, and that it's okay to have a really shit day, because that is normal. So when I hear people saying to me, I really appreciate you telling me or sharing or writing in your book or posting every day, this was a bit rubbish. And when, for example, it was my daughter's birthday last week, and she says suddenly, I know what I want for my birthday. And I think, thank goodness, I can go and buy it from the toy shop. And she says, I want my daddy back. And I think, shit, I can't do that. Fortunately, she then comes back a little while later and says, no, I've changed my mind. I want a unicorn. And I'm still crying, and she's moved on. I'm more than happy to share these experiences and share these moments and talk about the impact of these really awful experiences, because it encourages other people to do the same, and it opens that door for people to feel that they can talk about the shit times and hopefully maybe ask for help, or at least indicate to somebody that they're open to receiving some help. What would you add to that, Tom?
Quite hard to hear that one again. I think if you are able to persuade somebody senior to go first on this, to share some of their stuff, it's got to be authentic. People see performative leadership a mile off, where they're waving and smiling and saying all the right things on the awareness day. The reality of the situation is very different behind closed doors. This includes people who where they're talking the thing that well-being is part of our core values and care and that kind of thing, and not even talking about it within their own team. It's very obvious that that's being false, and it sucks, and people see it a mile off. But as Richard said earlier on in the chat box, this when you are able to have an ally and somebody who is able to make time for this subject, to share their stuff, to get a bit of, you don't need with vulnerability. See, I don't think you need to give all your medical details out, but just a little taster of the stuff that you've gone through and been through. Even if it's not the same, people bounce their experience off it, they can relate to it, and you cascade permission throughout the whole organization very quickly. And it's much showing people that you care on topics like this. It's so much more powerful than just telling them.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a phrase, our people are our greatest asset, which, I just can't stand it. Show them Don't tell them, show them,
Yeah.
and be a human being. I think human leadership, and down to earth openness can have such a life-changing impact on those around us. And it doesn't take much once you've started to open that door. Like you say, you're not sharing your whole medical history, but just letting people know that it's all right to have a shit day, and we all experience that. And some days are worse than others. But yeah, that final switch is all about being authentic and moving away from that polished version of ourselves that we feel we need to show people when we're standing up, particularly leaders in organizations, and encouraging one another to do the same, and starting that movement. It makes me think of the that video of the guy on the hillside who gets up and dances and feels really uncomfortable on his own dancing, and then somebody gets up and dances alongside him, and then before you know it, everybody's there dancing. And our dance now that we're talking about is showing that human side of ourselves and being open and honest with how we feel.
I think there was a period in my life where I found what we're talking about, the idea of being authentic and vulnerable, absolutely terrifying. So, have either of you got any suggestions for maybe a senior leader that is listening to this and maybe thinking, do you know what, I would like to be a little bit more me in front of everybody? Is there a kind of a few simple bits of advice or something they could do to help with that?
Yeah, do you want to go first, Tom?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. I think when I've seen it done quite well, somebody who's nervous about it, they'd like to do something, but it's new territory for them as well. Won't be spoken about around their dinner table, won't be spoken about at home. So to do things alongside somebody. So if you have an interview rather than somebody giving a talk, that can work, and you can have a sort of conversation around it. So literally somebody next to them. And also to sort of plan it a bit. I know we want to keep it fresh and authentic, but just to help them say some of the things and turn those feelings that have been kicking around them in a very kind of confused way into phrases, it will just help them practice basically, and so they'll be a bit more comfy on the day.
Yeah, absolutely. I think building on that as well. I was having a conversation with some people in a focus group in an organization where we talked about what was the most compelling communication that you've ever seen from your senior leaders, and why was it so compelling? And they said, we wish they brought back those videos that they used to do in COVID. They were really crappy amateur videos done on their own phones at home, like a 30-second snippet. But it made us understand who they were as human beings. And we really miss them. It's like the only thing we've ever missed about COVID is seeing our senior leaders being human beings in their own space. And they were 30 seconds long. So we're not talking, like you say, about long, drawn out, uncomfortable articles or conversations or films about our whole life stories. Little short snippets, little short moments that we can then build on. They're the most compelling things.
That's great. I think that's really useful, and I think it's really tangible. Is there anything that you'd like to say at the end to kind of wrap this up? I'll jump to you, Caroline. There's a few things that you want everyone to kind of remember from this session, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes we'll have these broad conversations about such a massive topic like suicide, which comes with so many different elements. And my main area that I focus on is postvention, like I said, which is all the support afterwards. But then we've got prevention, and we've got the intervention and the crisis kind of support in the middle. So there's a huge amount that we can cover, and sometimes it just becomes too much. So just to kind of summarize those things that I've talked about within those switches around becoming much more regular in the way that we communicate, shifting from that once a year box ticking exercise to regular updates, sharing what we're coming across, being much more informative. So understanding more about suicide and all that relates to it, the myths, the different signs that we might be able to look out for, all those sorts of things, and just upskilling ourselves in that area. And then that third part, being much more authentic and sincere in the way that we present ourselves and are a bit more open as human beings, and put those three things together, and suddenly we're becoming a little bit more compassionate in the way that we communicate, which will have that ripple effect. I think Tom had some bits to add there as well on planning.
My final point is that we could reasonably predict that this is going to happen at some stage. At work, someone close to work. Cherie's put in the chat box, it's not always about work or at work, and we completely get that. But, just for the focus of this session, we wanted to advise workplaces, and it is worth asking that question in the cold light of day, that what happens if this happens where I work? Who does what? Who gets to know? Who visits the factory? Who walks the floor? How do we liaise with the family, and run the idea or the event of suicide through your major incident plan at work? And that would naturally involve leadership and planning and comms and those kind of things as well. And it's so much easier to do that before an event occurs, but on the basis that it may well worth doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, everything you've said there is so relevant. And Cherie, I completely agree. I mean, none of this happened to me at work. It wasn't a work colleague, it was my husband. But so much of what I talk about in my personal life and the way that I've navigated that grief is relevant to compassionate communication and the impact that can have within workplaces.
What more on this? I had one with an individual. It wasn't in this country, but it was a senior person, and they were in HR, and they died by suicide. The family were rigid Catholic, so communicating about suicide was not something they wanted to do. So, given all your plans, be prepared to pivot given certain circumstances. Just stay curious around what the main people need and want here. Which is back to Caroline's point. If you've got the instinct of compassion on this, you'll do a good job.
That's a lovely place to end.
That was great. But thank you so much. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Tom. Thank you for being here. Thank you to everyone who turned up. This was a subject that I really wanted to talk about for a long time, and I wasn't able to do it because I didn't know how. And so I've learned a hell of a lot. So selfishly, thank you so much. But also thank you for, like we say, continuing this conversation, giving people the opportunity to be able to keep this top of mind. So thank you, everybody. Oh, and also, as I said in the chat, if there is something that you enjoyed or something you learned, please pop it in the chat before you leave, and any feedback that you have for us. These conversations I try to do at least once a month, and it really helps to have something that I can take and promote the next conversation, something positive. So thank you, everybody.